don't applaud yet because I've got one disappointing thing to say. The movie, which I was supposed to have this evening, just hasn't materialized. There has just been a new movie made, and it premiered recently, on the Canadian school, made at Keremeos. Unfortunately, that film, there are 2 copies of it, and one copy was supposed to go back to the Vancouver office midweek this week and come up Greyhound Bus to me this morning. No film on Greyhound Bus this morning, so I phoned down there. It still hadn't come back, and they said they would send me up one of the older films based on the European outer bound, excuse me, the European outer bound schools. And I said, well, you'll have to get it on the flight up this afternoon. So I put it on the plane, took it down there by taxi. I went down to the Peebles this afternoon, 4:30 to pick it up, no film. So I phoned down to Vancouver, phoned the Pacific Western people. They had no record of it. I said, well, could you check if it ever left Vancouver? It was sitting in the Vancouver freight office and had never been shipped. So I'm very, very sorry about it, because even the other film that I would have got is a very, very good visual expression of what the outer bound thing is all about. What I will try to do is, and I know some of you, this won't be any good for some of you, is try and get the Canadian one at some date in the near future and show it again at NDU. I know it's very heavily booked, but I'll try and get it for some time, say within the month, and then advertise it again through the paper and show it here. So what I had intended to do anyway was, as a lead up to the movie, was explain a little bit about Outward Bound, and particularly the Canadian school. Outward Bound began in the Second World War, during the war. It more or less had its birth out of the fact that there was a war. In Britain, particularly around the coastline of Britain, a lot of shipping was going down because of the German U-boat sinkings. And what was noticeable to some people involved in the shipping then was that, of course, there was an alarming loss of life at sea. But what they were amazed about was the fact that it was young people who were perishing at sea, and not particularly the older men who had been at sea for most of their life. It seemed that when these younger people who were involved in running the ships went into the water, and of course in the Atlantic water it's pretty cold, pretty alarming thing to happen to you, they just seemed to give up hope as soon as they hit the water. And the people who they did rescue, who survived ultimately, were often older people. There was a real significant difference between the survival ability between the older people and the younger people. And it was thought this maybe went back somehow into the preparation or experience that people had as they entered marine work. So it was thought that perhaps they might be able to introduce some sort of educational experience that would challenge young people so that they would be better able to deal with stress generally. And the immediate application of that in wartime was just to try and help people to survive better in the stress of going into the sea. And at that time in Britain, there was one particularly innovative educator for his time, and that was Kurt Hahn, Dr. Kurt Hahn, who had left Germany, I think, in pre-Hitler days. He'd been very innovative in education there, and I think more or less got run out of the country because of his more democratic points of view, and ended up innovating in the British educational system. He was one of the founders of Gordonstone School in Scotland, which runs a program with its academic elements, but also puts a terrific weighting on the use of the outdoors generally, the use of the sea, the mountains, etc., as media to expose people to challenge. Well, he, plus some people from the shipping lines, arranged for a very intense, brief challenge course, particularly for younger people in the late teens, early 20s group. And they found that after people had gone through this course, they were better equipped to deal with stress and emergency. And after that, there really was an alarming decrease in the mortality due to these U-boat sinkings. Well, after the war was over, it was realized that the sort of experiences people had in these challenge-type courses was just as applicable, of course, to peacetime. In fact, it was maybe even more relevant to bring into the general education system. And out of that wartime experience, it was decided to run some schools based still on the sea initially, And at Aberdyfi in Wales, the first outward bound school started. And the term outward bound indicates what it's about. It's to try and get people trained to be outward bound to life, rather than sort of self-centered or selfish. And this name somehow just caught on, outward bound. So the first school then at Aberdyfi in Wales, which opened in the late 40s, started to offer opportunities, 1 month courses, intensive courses, but using the sea as a medium to expose people to challenging situations. Well, it was such a success, and the demand to go on these courses was far in excess of the places available. Then they realised, of course, that it wasn't only the sea that could offer such a challenging challenge. Also, other media could be used, and the mountains particularly. Well, in Britain, a few schools started open shortly after that. The first outward bound mountain school opened in the northwest of England, in the Lake District. It's called Eskdale Outward Bound School. And I went through that school when I was about 17 on a course, and then subsequently went back and taught there over a period of years while I was at university in Britain. Other schools opened as well in Britain. There was one just girls' school in Devon. I think now there are about half a dozen or 7 schools in Britain, in England, Scotland and Wales. Also, it's spread to a lot of the Commonwealth countries, so there's schools in as faraway places as Malaya, Hong Kong, a lot of the African countries. Germany itself now has some, Norway. The United States developed, I think in the late 50s they opened a school, and there are now 7 or 8 schools there too. Canada, funnily, lagged behind and didn't develop one until the late 60s. When I first came out of British Columbia, in the Vancouver area, there were 2 or 3 people who had been through the outward bound experience in England and wondered why, in an area like this, with the opportunities it has for outdoor education generally, why hadn't there been some similar type of educational experience developed? And this led then to the establishment of the school at Keremeos, which is midway between Nelson and Vancouver. It's in the Similkameen Valley, just at the bottom end of the Okanagan. Well, that school, it was thought about in the middle 60s and actually opened its doors in 1969. 68 was used as a preparatory time to try and find a good location for the school. If you drive through that southern belt in BC, you might wonder why was Keremeos chosen. Because when you're down in the valley there, driving along the Similkameen, it sort of looks a bit stark, it looks almost desert-like. It's very dry. And when you're down in the valley there, you're enclosed, and you look up at the mountains and you think, well, those don't look all that rugged. But just south of that initial mountain facing Keremeos is the whole of the Cathedral Lakes Park in behind there, the Northern Cascade Mountains. And there is some very, very good alpine country, and it's accessible through a variety of routes, and that's the principal sort of outdoor laboratory of outward bound. The other thing is that in the British experience, they found that 90% of the time they were fighting the weather and could hardly get round to doing what they wanted to do because they were getting wet all the time. I remember days on end going out on expeditions, and you would leave the school, walk about 100 feet up the fell side, and you'd be right into the fog, into the mist there, and you'd be up at the hills 3 days and come back, and when you came back out you'd see the school, and that was it. You'd been in those hills for 3 days orienteering, wandering around in the mist. It was a challenge in itself, but you could do without that and get on with some of the other challenges. So this school, this site at Keremeos, was an ideal location. There's very little precipitation down there, so for the basic training, the basic exposure to outward bound type experiences, it's ideal. There's a good river there, a good canoeing river, very little built up area around about, lots of open space, some really good mountain faces, rock faces immediately around the school, within walking distance to do the preliminaries of rock climbing on, and then accessible by use of vehicles, this whole alpine area in behind Keremeos. At first people thought maybe it should be sited nearer Vancouver, in the coastal mountains, but that suffers the same problem that the British schools had of it being too wet most of the time. Also, it's just very, very difficult to move in thick forest. It's wet all the time. Plus, it's enclosed, and you don't see anything when you're going through it. It's pleasanter to have open country like it is around Keremeos. The only problems that hit in Keremeos were, of course, rattlesnakes, Rocky Mountain tick fever, poison ivy, and things like that they had to contend with. So some more challenges came in that way. Well, this experience, this outward bound experience, they found, there's been a lot of experimentation done to find when is it the best challenge to expose people to it. And standard courses have tended to be for people in their late teens, early 20s. They tried having senior courses in Britain where people over 25 went on them, and they found they were just a fantastic success. People in their 40s who went on these courses just wished they'd been on it when they were younger. They've changed the sort of physical aspect of it a little bit, but the challenges are the same. They substitute certain types of challenges for others. They tried also taking it back at the other end, to the younger end of the age group, and they found that younger people, maybe from 10 to 15, would enjoy it as a terrific adventure, but they didn't quite get what the outward bound experience was, and that was an experience of self-discovery through these challenging events. And they've compromised by having courses that ran for those, I think, between 15 and 17 as a junior type course, and the standard senior course being from about 16 and a half or 17 through to maybe late 20s. The Canadian school has been particularly dynamic in fielding a whole variety of courses, where some places in the world they have male schools and female schools. The Keremeos pioneered co-ed schools, father-son courses, executive courses, older people courses, just women's courses. They just about tried every type of variation on the theme. And the particularly successful courses have been these father and son courses, or even family courses where the whole family goes through the thing together. I think at Keremeos, the oldest people they've had on the courses now were in the 60s. They've had quite a few in the 50s go on the course, and even people in the 60s. So it's open almost to anybody, and the outward bound experience is applicable almost to any stage in life. The main sponsorship of the courses and the main enrollment on them has come for that age group, late teens through late 20s. But maybe just because it seems to be that age that wants to do that type of thing. Well, I've said what an outward bound school is, where they are, and so on, without getting yet much into the actual philosophy of them. The philosophy really is a continuation of this business of stress and challenge, to face unforeseen circumstances. And there's a motto really for outward bound, like a few words they use to describe it: it's self-discovery through adventure, for want of finding a better short phrase for it. What it really is a means through, it doesn't matter whether it's mountains or sea or what it is, it's to get people out of the normal lifestyle into a more challenging one with a variety of other people, and then putting them through things that they would never normally do, and they learn there whether they can face up to it themselves or not. And the normal educational experience, of course, is to measure people against some sort of set standards and see whether you fail or succeed at them. But the outward bound thing isn't that at all. It provides experiences, and what you do is challenge yourself against them, and you sort of set your own standards to meet. It's rather like circuit training, where you go in and you try it first of all, and you find that you can do 6 of these type of things, and 2 of those, and 3 of those a minute. And what you do then is see if next time you can make it 7 of these, and 3 of those. Well, it's rather like that. Most of the outward bound things are you set your own standard and then try and measure up to it with assistance from other people who can determine if it really is being a challenge for you. And at the end of the course, you can look back and survey just what your improvement in these things has been. Well, of course, a lot of the things are physical. There's a fair amount of swinging through trees, and you go into the river an awful lot. There's the rock climbing. In winter time, you get right up into that snow country, and there's igloo building, avalanche rescues, cross-country skiing, snowshoeing, the whole gamut of the types of things you can do in winter. In summer, it's, of course, principally kayaking and canoeing on the river, plus rock climbing and expedition work into the mountains. Now there is a standard sort of pattern for these courses. If you try to take an average out-of-bound course anywhere in the world, they're usually about 26 days, just a few days under a month. So you arrive on a Monday sort of and leave on a Friday, and it's almost a month in between. Some of the other courses, and you might have seen some of the literature, if you haven't, you can get some at the end here. There are some other courses too. There are shortened specialist canoe courses. Again, the Canadian school has pioneered a lot of innovations there. They've moved the whole operation over to Vancouver Island, for example, to run a surf canoeing school. They've gone out to, I think, into the Rockies and done canoeing there for a limited period. So the school isn't necessarily always operating out of Keremeos. For some specialist courses, they will move elsewhere. But the standard course is this 26-day deal. And there are 3 phases to a course, really. There's the initial experience of just finding out what it is you're going to get into, and a preparation period. Then there's a challenge period where you go through some initial types of things you might not have experienced before. And then the culmination of it is a 9-day trip into the mountains. In the earlier part of the course, you learn things like map reading, first aid. You're increasing your physical fitness through running and the ropes course, which is a standard thing almost at all out-of-bound schools. It's rather like a commando course virtually. You enter a series of a treed area at one end, and you have to get out at the other end without ever touching the ground. And you have to go up ropes, along rope bridges, down ladders, up catwalks, and all sorts of things. And your first time through there, you sort of give up after about the first 2 and come down. But the end of the week, you can maybe get along most of it. By the end of the course, everybody's running through that literally like monkeys. It's really just so that people can find out just how agile they are. And it's surprising, most people would look at this and think they would never do it. But eventually, over the period of the course, they do it. There's a fair amount of water comes into the course. It might sound rather dramatic, but you get up usually about 6:30 in the morning, and the first thing is to go and jump in the river. And then everybody's wide awake to start the day then. Each school has some type of thing that's applicable to that school. Well, Keremeos is right on a river, so they use the river an awful lot. Now some people say, well, I can't swim, or I have a fear of water. Well, no out-of-bound challenge is such that it pushes people into really traumatic things. It's done in a measured sort of way. Like rock climbing, people have fear of heights, but you don't immediately take somebody out on a great rock face and haul them up there. There are sort of nursery slopes and so on. And some people who thought they would never do it end up, by the end of the course, becoming rock climbers or kayakers or whatever. So it isn't just learning the skill itself, it's learning through doing that type of thing something about what your own boundaries are. And it's not only the physical things. There are other challenges too. There are things like some people might have difficulty expressing themselves, so during the course each person has an opportunity to stand up in front of all the others and tell them, say, about his hobby, what his favourite interests are, or something. And that might be a big challenge to somebody. So through all sorts of types of experiences, you can find something out about yourself. The thing I think that I found most challenging on a course was sometimes these courses depend on the instructors present and what their expertise is. And one fellow arrived who had been a paratrooper, and he decided to rig up a parachute jump in a tree. Well, up until that stage, I thought most of these challenges I could have a go at and feel reasonably confident in. Well, I got so used to, whenever I was on a rock face, desperately hanging on and hoping that rope would hold me, that when it came to standing about 60 feet high in a tree and jumping off, I was just averse to the whole thing. And what it was a parachute harness, and you stood on this little platform. I don't know if you've seen that advert on the telly for the Timex thing where the guy stands on top of a pole and dives off into a little pool. You feel like that. You're standing up there, and you're in this harness with a couple of ropes over your shoulders, and they go over some pulleys, over another couple of pulleys, and then right down the tree, and there's some chains at the bottom, some weights. And you jump off, and away you go, and it's free fall for about 60 feet, and then about 10 feet above the ground, the weight of the chain starts to act, and you sort of just gently come down onto a mattress and bounce up again. And the first time you don't think that's going to happen, you hear these screams come out of people as it can hurt them down. And then after your first 3 times, it's great, it's fantastic. And people then try to see how many somersaults they can do before they hit the ground. Well, this is typical, where you think at first, I'll never do that. You'll never get me to jump up there. But somehow, you get into the enthusiasm of doing these things. And even midway through the course, you're looking for things to do that are you try yourself out on. This is done sort of partly from an individual way, but also in group situations, a group challenge to do something. And again, it doesn't focus on the individual success or failure thing. There's a group thing. You maybe use some of this if some of your teachers in outdoor situations yourself, where you might set a challenge, and it is to maybe get across an imaginary chasm, and you've got a log and a bit of rope and something else, and the group has to, against a stopwatch, get over there without anybody falling down the chasm. Well, that's an example, maybe a poor example of some of the types of things you can do as groups. They have another two things that you find in all out-of-bounds schools. One is called a wall, and the other is called a beam. This wall is about maybe a bit higher than up to the windows there, and it's just some planking up against, two trees with a bar across them and this wall on it. When you first arrived out of bound, you're broken down to groups of about 10, and that's sort of loosely called a group of troll or something. And that group goes through the course together doing things. Well, this wall, what you've got to try and do is get your whole group over that wall without using any assistance from the sides or anything. So what it is you've got to make human ladders and heave people up and have people climbing up others and so on. And at first, it takes them about 2 hours to work out how to get up this thing. Then by the end of the course, they're challenging each other to see who can get over it fastest with a whole group of 10 people. And I think the record's about 11 seconds now to get 10 people over one of these walls. Another one is a beam, which is like a tree trunk thing, strapped again between two trees at just that awkward height, and you've got to try to jump to get hold of it. And it's all been peeled, so it's smooth. And again, you've got to get everybody over there. And again, it takes about an hour and a half, I think, the first time you go through it. Because if you try and get up there and sit on it and pull somebody, you slip off. I think they've got that down to about 8 seconds for a fast group going over there. So all sorts of different things like this happen in the group situation down in the school, and this happens in this initial sort of orientation or preparation period. There's a little bit of formal academic work in map reading, first aid, and all this is done through where in a normal situation you learn first aid from the book and you sit there and put a sling on somebody or put a bandage around the head. What they do at Out of Bound is it's this patrol's turn to meet a calamity right now. So they've maybe been out down the ropes course and they're on the way back to the school, and one of the instructors will be lying there in the grass looking as though he's put an axe through his leg, and it'll all be made up, it'll look like it, and the patrol arrives and they see this, and unbeknown to them, you see, it's been set up, and it's a real challenging experience. So another time they'll bring a vehicle and make it look as though it's run over somebody, and for all intents and purposes it's a real situation, and they'll learn what to do about an emergency. And then, they then analyse it afterwards and say, well, what went wrong? Did we do the right thing? And you really learn through situations like that. Then you go through, of course, the standard things of first aid, what to do in emergencies in the mountains, orienteering, survival, what foods you can eat, and so on. You really become sort of quite a competent outdoorsman. In between times, you're getting a little bit of exposure to rock climbing under expert sort of supervision. There's never more than, say, 2 students with 1 instructor on the rock climbing, and you spend maybe a day at it initially just to get the hang of it on easy slopes, and then gradually to build it up to, until you're doing some fairly good climbs. The same with canoeing. They have very good kayak people there, learning the basics of it. Until then, people are whitewater running from Princeton, I think, all the way down through Keremeos, running that river. People who had never even been in a canoe before, within a matter of a few days, because of the intense exposure to it. So these are things you do in the preparation period. Then in this challenge period, they then try and see if you can now manage some of these skills on your own. And you put into sorts of situations where you can measure yourself against what you're now learning. This then leads into the period where you go off for 9 days up into the high country in the North Cascades, and the initial period you go in with an instructor, you've been learning everything with your instructor and your patrol, sort of, with help from other instructors in specialist types of technique like rock climbing, canoeing and so on. Then when you go on this 9-day experience, first of all you just get up there. As soon as you arrive in the high country, each student then goes off and spends a 3-day solo in part of that area. Now, as far as you're concerned, if you're there, it is a solo. You're given an area to go into, you find your way there, you have a bivouac tent, just the basic necessities of survival and getting by, and you're off into your area. But of course, as far as Outward Bound is concerned, it's very supervised. There is an instructor somewhere in that area, but he makes himself sort of invisible. But he's there just in case something goes wrong. Also, each student has specific instructions to do what to do if something does go wrong. Each has a whistle and a flashlight and so on for giving out a signal if they need help. And the instructor's never more than, say, about a quarter or half a mile away from where these people are. They don't know that when they're there. And for many students on the course, if you ask them at the end of a course, what was most challenging to you? Of all the things, you might think it's things like this parachute jump or going in the water or something. I would say most of them say it's this solo. It's the first time in their life when they've actually really been on their own. And this just a solo experience. They're out there for 3 nights. And you really do start to think about yourself when you've been out there 3 days. You're wondering, what the hell am I doing here, first of all? Then you get through that and think, well, what is this Outward Bound thing all about? And some of them curse it at first. And then gradually start to realise, this is the first time I've really sat down here and thought what the heck I am doing. And at the end of that, you get people coming out, they're so enthusiastic, they suddenly have started to realise things about, when I get back home, I just realise now what I'm going to do with the rest of my life, or this, that, or the other. They come up with some remarkable types of things. Others, it isn't such a good experience. Other things have been a challenge to them. Some have spent a lot of time on their own. But if you just think about yourself, think, when were you really on your own for that length of period in an exposed area where you have to really rely on just what you've got sort of in a small pack? And there aren't many people who really have had that sort of experience. Well, they have those 3 days, then they come back into the group again. Then they break down into groups of about 3, 4, or 5, never less than, say, 3 or 4. And then they have a number of checkpoints to go through to make their way back to the school over the next 4 days. And it's up to them now to put into practice all the things they've learned. The instructor, again, he disappears. He checks at these checkpoints every now and again to see if they've been through the sign in the card. But that might be on the top of that peak, and over there, and then over in that glacier there might be one. They go through these checkpoints and eventually work their way back to the school in a group. Now, a lot of these people have never been out of the city before. And yet, just 3 weeks into this Outward Bound experience, here they are in the high country, totally competent, totally able to survive and do what they're doing, and come back safely, having had a terrific experience. It's similar in wintertime, except that you're on skis and you're carrying everything with you. There's not as much distance to cover. You usually end up building a snow hole or igloo. But it's the same type of deal. At the sea schools elsewhere in the world, there's one sea school up in Scotland which has one of these 3-masted schooners. Instead of going to the mountains for an expedition, they go off around the north coast of Scotland, the Atlantic, on a voyage for a period of time. And they learn the basics of seamanship, and they actually run the vessel in the air. So, and then come back to the school. Each school has its type of thing to do. Some of the African schools are desert schools. In Australia, there's a very good canoe school, sea canoeing, surfing. And where you do Eskimo rolls here, they do end-to-end rolls in the surf. By then, of course, most people are doing these things. The United States schools have experimented with a lot of techniques too. They do a lot of river running. Where you sit in a little rubber raft in a rubber dinghy, come down the rapids. That would have been in the movie I would have shown if it had arrived. There's some very good shots in this of all these varieties of activities. Anyway, at the end of the course, you end up then having been through an experience which has exposed you to a lot of challenges to which you can measure yourself. You're not really sort of challenging yourself against that fellow. He might be very good at rope climbing, say, but not very good in the water. You might have been. Or you might have been good at some other activity. It's a total way you do your thing when you're there. This leads around to, why do people really end up going there? Unfortunately, in some parts of the world, some people get sent there, and it's unfortunate because they then see it as some sort of corrective type of thing they're going through. In Britain, I know, I would say a fair percentage of people who came through the school that I was at would probably come from industry, were apprentices, and this would be actually part of the apprenticeship course, and they would get paid to go there. All their costs are found and everything. You've got a few students who sponsor themselves. You've got odd students sent by corrective institutes, like hostels or approved schools or whatever. You've got police cadets coming, military cadets. Just a total cross range. School kids coming. Some older people financing themselves. There's a real mix in there. And when they came, there was no division into groups of, oh, these are this type of people and these are this type of people. They were just ad-lib mixed together. So you might find a police cadet sharing his bivouac on his 3-day expedition with this guy from the approved school. And that's the challenge itself. They'll learn an awful lot about each other. They find the human beings, and that he isn't that type of person, he's that type. They suddenly discover, the world's a little bit different than they thought it was. Because you pulled them out of the stereotyped, regular lifetime role and immersed them in a different experience altogether. And they really do discover some different things about themselves. And I've seen that in some patrols I've had in the mountains where I've had people from some of the corrective places with other people more authoritarian. Sometimes it ends up with the people you wouldn't have thought of relying on the others in some sorts of circumstances. And this is a very interesting role thing. In the North American type of thing, particularly in Canada, people tend to sponsor themselves an awful lot more. The schools are directed at trying to ask people, do you want to really experience something like this? If you do, it's there for you as an opportunity. And I think most people who go through the Keremeos school are there through their own choice, wanting to do this. The way other organisations come into it is in assisting to sponsor people going through Out of Bound. Out of Bound is intended to be equal opportunity. Anybody can come. It's a charitable organisation, that is, it's non-profit making. So it isn't trying to rip you off when you do a course. That cost, that is a cost fee, represents what it costs them to run the course. It's on a break-even basis. They go after money from the usual trusts and things to get capital costs to build the school, get the equipment and so on. But it's very, very cheap considering what you're going through. The American schools charge quite a bit more than, say, the Canadian school. If I'd got this film here today, there was a lot of new literature coming up with it too. These ones I had to go around and dig out because some of them are a little bit dated on the dates the course is given. But basically these describe them. You might see some prices here which now will be 74, 75 types of prices, which will have changed a bit. But this is where Out of Bound is its own thing. If you saw that course and you thought, well, I'd like to go on that one, but I just can't afford it. If you could afford it, fine, no problem. If you can't, and you phone Out of Bound and contact them, they'll say, well, how much can you afford? And if the cost was, say, $500, and you say, well, I can rustle up $100. Well, okay, pay you $100, and we'll cover the rest of it for you on sort of an interest-free loan. You pay it back when you want to, or over any period of time. We'll come to an arrangement on that. You might not be in a position to be able to pay it back, say. Well, in that sort of situation where there's somebody in real need who just cannot meet the financial commitment, then Out of Bound will bring into place some of its bursary monies that it's got from somewhere. Or it might contact some local organisation in your area and say, look, if there was someone here who would think needs to go on a course, is very interested in going on a course, would you be willing to sponsor them? And quite a few students come through the course in that way. So the money thing need not necessarily be an obstacle to getting into a course. It's a month in that sort of situation. All you have to arrive in is boots and some old clothes, and everything else is provided. Pack, sleeping bag, the heavy gear that you might need, like duvets in winter time, and climbing gear, the whole lot. All that equipment is supplied. Plus it's sort of board and lodge for the month too, all thrown into that. So it works out at not being very expensive at all. The shorter courses, of course, are correspondingly less in price. I don't think anybody who's really wanted to go has ever been refused going because of the money thing. Just maybe in closing, and maybe you'd like to ask some questions. I'd like to point out that the way Outward Bound has been accepted has been really enthusiastically by those who know something about it. Students who go through the courses are the best people for advertising them. But also in some universities now, Simon Fraser University and Notre Dame, for example, allow students to go on courses and get credit for them. Here we allow one full course credit if you go through an Outward Bound course towards your degree. Simon Fraser, they tried experimentally putting through teacher trainers in the School of Education through a course and allowed 8 semester hours of credit for it. And the almost unanimous response from people there was that it was the most challenging and most rewarding course of the whole university career. That they learned more in that about what they really were going to do with their lives than in any of the other courses. Or so who missed a month of school and gone through the Outward Bound course, as against a control group of 220 or so, that the ones who'd gone through the Outward Bound school, representing just a typical cross-section of the other one, worked out better in terms of all the ways you can measure them in exams and all the rest of it, after they'd been on the Outward Bound. So, this is self-reinforcing for the Outward Bound experience. Manpower and Immigration somehow got involved in seeing that it was useful in terms of some sort of training. So that means now it's eligible for tax deduction. So half the cost fee that you pay if you're paying it out of your own pockets is non-taxable. So there's been various ways Outward Bound has worked at trying to get the cost down and make it more attractive to people. I'll just see if there's a couple of more points I would like to cover just before I finish. In Britain, they did a survey called the Fletcher Report, which was a follow-up just to try and measure educationally what the value of Outward Bound had been. And Fletcher was actually a professor at the University of Bristol in the education department there. And he did a good follow-up study on, I think, something like 100,000 people had been through Outward Bound by that stage. So he had good samples to work on. And he did a fairly thorough survey on it through questionnaires, actual interviewing, visiting schools, following up people who've been now 10 years out of Outward Bound, checking just to see what the carryover value of it was. And these are just a summary of some of the results. Findings, the main points brought to light in Fletcher's findings from the sponsor's point of view, people who assisted in sending students were, the sponsors' objectives, 80% of the sponsors sought improvement in general maturity in the students they sent. Others looked for ability to work with people and development of various qualities. Estimates of success of courses by sponsors. 98.5% of the sponsors considered the courses to be a success, and they were paying for the course, so, of whom over half considered the results to have been highly successful. 1.5% of them considered the courses to be a failure. In terms of improvement of self-confidence and self-awareness, 70% of the sponsors reported that they observed an increase in the students' self-confidence. 73% noted an increase generally in what you can measure as maturity. He also looked into, had these people then been more successful? Unfortunately, this is measured in terms of things like promotion and so on. But actually, the promotion rate was in an order of 20 or 25% higher than the control group. It's maybe not one of the best ways at all to measure what Outward Bound is really about. Then persistence of influence. 55% of the sponsors believed that a single Outward Bound course had a lifelong influence. 38% believed the influence would be for years, measurable in years. Then, that was the sponsor's point of view. He assessed that against what the actual people who participated in it thought, and he found it just about corresponded and tallied. There was a tendency to be more highly enthusiastic for those who've been through it. And I've talked to a variety of people. I've been through it. I just thought it was tremendous. I think it's a very valuable experience because I'm highly biased in the presentation. But it's interesting. At some presentations I've been to about Outward Bound, first of all, before the person's given the talk, he's asked, has anybody here been to Outward Bound? You get the odd one. And he gets them just to say what they thought about it. And one or two say, well, I found that hard and this hard. But the general type of thing is a very, very positive type of response. The university students who went through it, almost to a man, say it should be mandatory. When you go to university, you should send on one, because you might then change your mind whether you want to stay in university, or else you'll do a hell of a lot better when you're there. It's this sort of thing. I suddenly realised it's a very positive thing. Then it comes down to just actual experiences you hear about. There's a fellow who went through outbound last summer at Keremeos, and he worked on the tugboats down Vancouver there. And he was out in one in Georgia Strait in very bad weather, and it started to sink, this boat. And he just got prepared for the fact that he was going to go into the water. And the fellow who was with him had never been into outward bound. And he sort of worked it out with this guy, what they were going to do to make sure they could survive, say, for at least 24 hours. And he methodically did it. And the boat actually went down, but just as the boat went down, I think they were rescued by helicopter. But he right away dropped back into thinking, what would I have done if I'd been in outward bound and had this to do? There have been a lot of similar things talked about by students who've been in very, very trying circumstances, who said that it was an outward bound experience. They suddenly thought back, now how do I handle this? So I think it speaks for itself. Maybe I said enough. Maybe I can give you some other responses through what you might like to ask yourselves. Again, I must apologise for the fact the film wasn't here, because that expresses far better than what I can say. I just hope if I can get it in the near future, I will show it. The outward bound thing, since I arrived up in Nelson, I've managed to get some people from outward bound to come up every now and again and talk to a variety of groups, community groups particularly, like the service clubs and people like Rotary and Kinsman and all these others, have expressed an interest in, if anybody in the area has difficulty in getting to a course, they will assist in some way, whether it's even just paying the bus fare. They'll try and do what they can for people who want to go. We have had now a number of people from the area go to outward bound and come back and say it was well worth, it was up to their expectations. I put everybody to sleep. Well, the literature I have here, as I say, please ignore some of the prices on it. I've got just a couple of pamphlets that are to do with these junior courses. That's the 15, 16-year-old type of thing. There's one on canoe and kayak courses, and then one on the regular type of thing, what they call a senior course, just a regular standard course. This article was written by John Hazel, who was the first director of the school down at Keremeos, and he then became the director of Outward Bound and did the PR work all across Canada. And it's a very good synopsis. It'll tell you quite a bit of the sort of field I've covered in it. And then this last brochure here sums it all up and gives the address and so on to write to in Vancouver for further information or listings of courses and so on.
Is it just one school?
This was the first in Canada. There is a school now developing in sort of between Ontario and Quebec, and it's just run as a summer school at the moment. The Keremeos one started off as a summer-fall school, and then as people got to know about it and the demand got heavier, they were then able to move into using winter courses too. So the Keremeos one is the first all-year-round school, and I'm not sure if the Ontario one will be able to run that way or not. It's just the severity of the winter that's difficult, but I'm sure they'll find an adaptable way to do it.
They were also thinking of having a C school in British Columbia. That's not
they're hoping to work towards that eventually. What they're waiting for at the moment is the build-up in demand, because to run one outward bound school is based on a certain amount of population. In Canada, with its small population, it was difficult enough just to get that first school going and to keep it above water, literally. And then as soon as there was enough demand, particularly there were students coming from Newfoundland, Alaska, and all over the place to Keremeos school. As soon as there was enough demand in the east and enough people going back and advertising it in a way, it was then worth opening that one. Now, a C school is very, very expensive to run, far more expensive than a mountain school, because the capital investment is that ship. And they're wanting to get sort of three-masted schooner type of deal to go around Vancouver Island. But the investment in that, there's got to be, build up that demand a bit more, but I would suspect soon there will be the development of a C school. Certainly hope so.
Thank you very much. Your enthusiasm is very impactful.
Okay.
Before we begin tonight's program, there are two announcements. The first is that the Valhalla Committee's presentation will occur tomorrow at noon in the theater. And the second is that all those of you who have not registered, we request you to do so. There's no enforcement committee, we may add, but it would certainly help the conference in many ways. The real star of the program tonight is Dr. Valerius Geist, a man whose distinguished qualifications it would be literally impossible to summarize in this brief introduction. He has a PhD from the University of British Columbia in zoology under Dr. McTaggart Cowan, who himself is a very famous man, and he did his postdoctoral work at the Max Planck Institute in West Germany under the Nobel Prize winner Konrad Lorenz. Dr. Geist is also one of the founding fathers of the Faculty of Environmental Design at the University of Calgary, where he currently teaches. This alone gives you some idea of the kind of academic qualifications he has. His academic specializations are animal behavior, with special emphasis on large animals, in particular large herbivores. And he is also interested in mammalogy and ecology as related to these herbivores. He also tells me that the focus of his work is observational studies on Canadian big game animals, and he's apparently done a great deal of lengthy field work in this area. And an emerging area of specialization is the application of human biology to environmental design. His present research concerns ecology, ethology, and the evolution of mammals, including man. Dr. Geist informs me that his future research will focus on problems of behavior in large mammals, including humans, in natural and artificial environments, and I think we can all see the significance of that term, artificial environments, there. And the topic of his speech tonight will be the significance of environmental education for an understanding of optimum human environments. So he will be talking to us directly about this topic. And one other thing I'd like to note, that two of his books are available, one of them in paper from the University of Chicago Press called Mountain Sheep, A Study in Behavior and Evolution, another by the University of Cornell Press, Man and Sheep in Northern Wilds, and this deals mainly with BC. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Valerius Geist.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ladies and gentlemen, I was asked to address myself to the question of environmental education. Why bother with it? Why should we have it? Why should we spend a considerable number of man-hours, particularly in public schools, on such a subject? There are enough critics of the present school systems. There are enough critics of any movement that has risen its head and has had environment and ecology associated with it. Some of these critics point out to the dismal performance of some of our students from these institutions, and they're not entirely wrong. I have to deal with them. I can assure you that the level of English at times is abominable, and even that at universities. I can assure you that even in graduate schools, I have sent at least two students packing because the English was utterly impossible. When we have something of this nature going on, why environmental education? As a scientist, I'm only too familiar with the following. Science progresses in fads. We had the great fad of animal work and animal labor, for which institutes were being built in the 1930s. Who has ever heard of it? We had the fad of bioenergetics, which came and went. Molecular biology, now environment. Is the same thing taking place in those areas that educators are active in? Is this going to be something like the new math that came, stayed, and may be going? Why environmental education? What is to be gained from it? You must understand that when I am talking here, I have only the obligation to address you as a scientist, which means that I have no business speaking about the environment in terms that a poet, a writer, maybe a painter would be much more able to do than I. The only thing that I can address you about is environmental education as perceived by a scientist, by an ecologist, and I have to appeal to your reason, and I must make sure that I must not appeal to emotions, and I must make sure that I must not advocate. A scientist has no business advocating. A scientist has to produce propositions that are testable in principle and leave it at that. Why environmental education? To some extent, of course, it is critical that environmental education be brought in, if for no other reason than to point out to individuals that in a society which has become increasingly complex and which is still complexifying, that there are limits and bounds beyond which our economic system and our political system ought not to penetrate. Because I am a scientist, and because I am daily sitting at the edge of knowledge, because I am sitting where information at times is scanty, where opinion may be rife, and where good theoretical pronunciations may not have yet been developed. Because I'm sitting there, I at times almost hesitate to speak about some of the matters which I do know today are relevant, because I am one of the few, or maybe the only one at times, who has gained sufficient insight to talk about a given matter. But from my perspective, it is now very clear indeed that a touch of environmental education would be most useful in ameliorating some of the new fads that our society is getting itself into. Let's take the matter of energy. Energy shortages are words that have great currency today. From my perception, of course, there are several ways in which I look at energy, and basically I'm looking at the globe as a system driven by the energy of the sun. I can compartmentalize the pathways that come, and so far we're still talking strictly about energy matters. The four major pathways are: we obtain energy through living matters, and the living matter here is the transducer of that energy. It stands between us and the sun, and these are our renewable resources. And there are also, of course, the stored old stores of energy that went through the living system, today available as hydrocarbons, and which we're using up very quickly. There is energy that comes via the climatic factors, and which we harness at times as water and as wind. Then there is the next pathway, which is starting to become of interest, although it is not significant at present. That's the direct conversion of sunlight. And finally, we obtain energy from the earth crust via geothermal or nuclear power. I brought this out because in every case, from 1 to 4, the word energy is being used. Energy, 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 as if we are talking about entirely convertible entities. But the energy that comes to us, which we use, which drives our civilization, the energy that comes via the living matter, is of course qualitatively of an entirely different kind than the energy which may come to us via stores in the earth crust. In short, our civilization does depend on a type of energy that cannot be equated with electricity, that cannot be equated with the energy liberated by steam. It is that energy that you and I need every day in our digestion. It is important that one makes a difference between energy that is stored in the food, that drives a living system, and energy which comes in another form. Because I happen to be in a faculty of environmental design, and because I do meet people that are today very topical in these areas, I can only point out that a loose talk about energy is not appropriate. We do have to focus on the pathways in which the energy that we utilize comes to us. Living matter is basically organized in a great number of diverse ecosystems. The functions of these ecosystems to us have to be brought out. The fact that they generate food for us, and nutrients, and materials, and that they clean the air and the water that we utilize. In the Western world, we do not place a great store on food. We have not gone hungry frequently enough. We consider it as something that is to be taken for granted. We think nothing of wiping out large areas of the most valuable agricultural land in order to transform that area into something we consider of greater value, like electrical power. We flood areas. We destroy them, and we do not quite think that those areas may be in the future, or may even be today, of very great importance indeed, as producers of a type of energy that cannot be equated with electricity. It is quite surprising the number of individuals that are not clear at all that you do require communities of plants, large communities of plants, and an interaction of these plants with water and wind in order to clean just that what we ingest. We do need clean water. We do need clean air. These are necessities. Yet they are not necessities that shine brightly in the mind of somebody who has been raised in an urban ecosystem, who has lost contact with the soil. This is something that is almost faddish to these individuals. And you are aware, of course, that 80% of Canada is urbanized, and that the predictions are that even a greater portion of our population shall soon be living in urban areas. We are going to be dealing increasingly with a population alien from the land. And it is not that this population does not go out and ski, or fish, or hunt, and be outside, but in their practical everyday dealing, when they are actors in the socio-economic system that we call our own, they are not so cogent of the great values that natural ecosystems have for us. Of course, it is not only natural ecosystems. We depend on ecosystems for our existence, and we depend primarily on altered ecosystems. The altered ecosystems being, of course, those of agriculture. And we speak today as if any alteration of the ecosystem is quotation mark bad. Well, this simply cannot be taken entirely to be the case. We alter ecosystems by simplifying them, by increasing the yield from these ecosystems of precisely those products that we deem most valuable. And we accept this, and I don't think we have any choice but to accept this as a good and proper way in which to make use of the earth. But again, there is an ugly component that crops up again and again and again in those that have power in our society, and that is the lack of appreciation of the slow changes which ecosystems altered by human beings undergo. Of course, it is classical textbook stuff that we do have areas of the world which used to be forested at one time, which used to support fields at a later date, which became grazing areas somewhat later, and which are deserts today. It is known, but somehow it does not penetrate into the conscience. Nor is it known that there is another way in which an ecosystem can be degraded, and that the terminal stages of that ecosystem is an acid moor or an acid bog. Many, many areas and large areas of Great Britain are a living testimony to that today. Great Britain used to be covered by deciduous forest, by a very extensive cover of deciduous forest. Beginning with the Bronze Ages, there is a noticeable change in the pollen profiles, indicating that clearing was taking place. The people that were living in those days opened up the forest along the river valleys, slowly but surely, pushed it further back and further back and further back. And the consequence of deforestation is that you do destroy the deep root systems that reach far into the soil and which continuously drag up minerals through those root systems into their leaves. When these leaves fall to the ground and decay, they liberate the nutrients, creating on the surface of the soil a rich surface layer. It is that surface layer, ladies and gentlemen, that is so useful in agriculture. It is that surface layer which, till it is exhausted, can produce fields of grain, and once it begins to go towards exhaustion, of course, it does turn into a sour meadow, which can be utilized in turn by livestock. If you destroy the forest over top, then you stop the cycling of nutrients, the normal cycling. The result is that the nutrients at the top are slowly washed away by waters, and it takes centuries for this process to take place. In fact, it takes millennia. And the result is an acid topsoil. And after the acid topsoil comes the bog, and after the bog, the accumulation of peat, and after the accumulation of peat, the erosion of peat, and the production of very poor agricultural soils. That is another end product, and it has to be appreciated. We tend to live in a time in which the time scale that we act by, instead of becoming larger as science penetrates both forward and backwards in its vision, seems to become smaller. The planning horizon for a politician is well known. The planning horizon for an economist is barely larger than that. It is for this reason odd to these people when someone starts to talk about the greater time scales and about such events as glaciations, which today are starting to get into the news, although some of us who have been interested in glaciations and periglacial phenomena, and I have been that for a good number of years, were able to point out already 5 years ago that some of our weather patterns started to approach those that we had postulated would be taking place during the Pleistocene, which means that we would find a greater precipitation and greater cold in the old centers of glaciation, the old epicenters of glaciation, that is the very, very centers which have the highest mass of ice. The deserts would be spreading, because that is exactly what takes place during glaciations at the same time. That climates become much more irregular, and this has been more or less become accepted today. We're apparently heading now into a small ice age, little ice ages, of which there have been a number since the last deglaciation, in fact 3. And we're likely to have another 2 or 3 before the major glaciation, which is next to come at around about 20,000 years from now, will take effect. These planning horizons, these horizons have absolutely no relevance to planning at the present time. They are horizons that don't seem to matter to anyone, but they do matter to a biologist, because I would be a total hypocrite if I were, what I have been doing, very much concerned with the conservation of large mammals, and would have no concern for ourselves. And millennia in zoologic history are a very, very short time indeed, are insignificant in fact, and the rhythm of the ice ages can become to one very familiar indeed. Our land tenure system, of course, totally inappropriate on a globe in which ecosystems shift and in which environments change drastically. But this, as I said, is of no concern to those which presently have the power. It will be of no concern to those that have today's powers, because you do not change persons very basically once they are beyond a certain age, and particularly if they have responsibilities and must be accountable to the populace. But there's always a hope for another generation to grow up and develop. What is so very important to bring across to those which will hold power in the future is that when we are dealing with environment, we are dealing with ecosystems. If we're dealing with ecosystems, be they man-made or natural, we're dealing with systems. And that systems have the nasty habit of not being predictable. Systems do things that are counterintuitive. Systems play dirty, ugly tricks on you without you ever being able to see that in advance. I will give you an example. This example is almost 100 years old and should be common knowledge. But it happened in Germany when the Rhine, which was in those days a winding river, was deemed to be a hindrance to the progress of shipping. And it was straightened. They went ahead and took out all the elbows out of it, and it became a straight river. That was considered to be a great, great feat indeed. But then the water, of course, accelerated in its speed. And as it accelerated in its speed, so did its kinetic energy increase. And the River Rhine dug deeper and deeper and deeper into its old bed, till it was gone past its old bed. And it continued to dig deeper and deeper, till it had dug itself well below the level of the water table, and began to drain the surrounding lands of water. The countryside began to wither. Agricultural production, of course, dropped. Thereafter, the Germans went ahead and started building weirs on the Rhine in order to bring up the level of the water again, so that the water table may be maintained in that area. And that, of course, cut down on the speed of shipping, which was originally the whole reason for straightening the Rhine. I'm afraid we are continuing to go and interfere with ecosystems. Here, of course, damming is of some concern, and dams are a beautiful example of it. I very well remember an acquaintance of mine who went into engineering, who was so enthusiastic about the potential of making each drop of water work on behalf of humanity, that he said, he was a German, and he could make wonderful statements in German. He said something to the effect that may no drop of water go down to the sea without its share of work. Well, this is a perfectly understandable way of looking at things, except that we are starting to see today that, in fact, human beings need not only harvest the might and the force of a river by simply tapping its electric energy. Ladies and gentlemen, every great civilization that rose tapped the force of the river, and it did so in a much more delicate way than we are doing today with dams. Take any of the great civilizations, the Egyptians, the Mesopotamians, the civilizations on the Yellow River, Mekong, Ganges, or in the coastal streams of Peru. They have one thing in common. They all clustered around a flooding river. A river who delivered not only a pulse of energy in the form of floodwaters down the valley and knocked out the climax vegetation in that area, pushing it back to a much more productive early cereal stage. They also harvested the pulse of fertility that came down that river, a fertility that was born in the headwaters, in the snowfields, in the glaciers. All these rivers have glaciers and snowfields in their headwaters, every one of them, because it is, of course, snowfields and glaciers that grind rock into dust, make it into fertile silt with pH that may be anywhere between 8 and 9, fertility itself, in other words, and which spew it down the river and which fertilized the land around it. Those civilizations depended on the energy and of the pulse of fertility that came down the river every year. They did make use of the waters. They did make use of the free energy, but in a way that seems to have escaped us almost entirely. Only today are some of these concepts starting to arise, and we're starting to get an insight what, in fact, civilizations depended on. We have the short planning horizon, of course, when we are dealing with dams. A good many dams already have been built in this world that are useless today because they have been filled by debris, filled by silt, filled frequently because of secondary activities of human beings in the distant landscape through which the water ran ultimately into the dam. There's no point for me to go on and elaborate on these horror stories because there is published information available on it. And indeed, we have every reason to consider and reconsider some of these dams. And then there is another matter which happens to be something that is of interest to me. It is only by this much that I became a zoologist instead of a professional officer. And I'm still interested in military matters. And whenever in fact, I lived in Germany rather close to the place where dam busters were active. And if they had any foresight, they would have done what they did a heck of a lot earlier and would have done it much more systematically than they did it. And then I look, you probably realize now with what eyes I look at dams at times, particularly when they are organized into such megalomaniac conceptions as the Nawapa Treaty, which we will almost certainly hear something again about. Almost certainly. It's going to crop up again. And there will be a rush for Canadian waters to inundate the fields of the thirsty American West and Southwest. I don't know any better way to make ourselves utterly vulnerable than to create a large number of dams. They're pinpoint targets. You don't have to even use atomic weapons. Good God. Don't need that at all. Once you get enough dams in the countryside, you need a fifth column with Avis rent-a-truck and loaded with dynamite. To be active as future deputy ministers. What else? I was not dealing with academics. Academics I can deal with on an entirely different plane. I was dealing with those people that wanted to become decision makers. Now, when you ask yourself, what are you going to teach them about human beings? You don't have too many questions that rank at the top of the priority. And the uppermost question was, what can we do to ensure human health via environmental design? How to structure an environment that maximizes health. I have to make this statement to you because what I have to say is a logical consequence of following up on this question, which in turn ultimately led me to a theory that that has gained a considerable amount of foothold with those that have studied societies, animal societies, and which has been a very powerful explanatory hypothesis in explaining human societies. And that is that the social structure that a society has is a function of the economic strategy that it has assumed. And in human societies, you must add also of the traditions that have been carried with that society. These are the two most dominant factors. But that in itself is not terribly interesting. Not interesting unless two other factors are known. The economic strategy of any society depends on the ecosystems it is exploiting, man-made or natural. And the other one, which is much more devastating in its implications, is that human beings appear to have a great range of plasticity in their development. Well, that is known, that's no problem. We knew that from animals as well. But what is more important is that environments tend to shape individuals in a rather predictable fashion. Now, I was interested to answer the question of health, to develop a theory of health. And for this reason, it was quite obvious to me that certain types of development of individuals tended to produce individuals that were much more healthy than other types of individuals. So that I got myself into what may be called, under a sort of more catchy term, the biology of inequality. You must realize, ladies and gentlemen, that it is possible for zoologists to look at individuals from animal populations and to give a rather good informed opinion about the type of the quality of environment that these individuals experienced during their growth and development. I can do this with most large ungulates today, and so can a good many of my colleagues. But the same principle applies to human beings. I'm going to dwell a little bit on health and then come back to development. A very popular conception of health is that it is the absence of diseases. You can refine this and you can claim that health is the maintenance of homeostasis. That makes it a little bit more fancier, expresses it in more positive terms. What it basically means but it means the same thing. The individual is not suffering from any debilities or diseases. This is a definition that is useful to doctors, and it's a very limited definition, and it is a useless definition when it comes to environmental design. Because under the narrow definition of health, an individual can be considered healthy, although he's quite incompetent in looking after himself, and he must have somebody around and about that helps that individual. In short, you can produce imbeciles that are perfectly healthy, and that hardly is an environment that we would like designed, have anyone designed towards. And for this reason, a somewhat different definition of health is adopted. A definition that states that it is the ability of the individual to maintain homeostasis. Not the fact that he has homeostasis, the ability to maintain homeostasis. And that leads us to the next step, namely, in order to have the ability to maximize one's state of staying within homeostasis, one has to maximize basically three things. And that is physical, intellectual, and social competence. In short, health is not divisible from the ability of an individual to look after himself. And I must emphasize once more, that means very, very high capabilities physically, intellectually, and socially. If you go and then look at the kind of development that is associated with health in animals, you suddenly find that you run into phenotypes that tend to be very large, very robust, very heavy bones, beautiful bones, that technically speaking have tissues of low growth priorities very well developed, and that are very vigorous in their activities. These are the individuals that on one hand fulfill the criteria of being physiologically exceedingly healthy. On the other hand, they also fulfill the criteria that they are enormously capable physically, and we do know from our behavioral studies that they also tend to be behaviorally very capable. We're still dealing here with animal studies. In other words, if you want to gain some rather basic insights into what mammalian systems do, it is a good idea at times to look at animal populations. I identified in previous years these types as a high quality population. And when I speak about the development of of tissues of low growth priorities, I should state that your body doesn't grow equally. There are certain parts of your body that grow almost irrespective of the food and environmental conditions you encounter, and there are other parts of the body which do not. They are very sensitive to the food and the conditions that the body itself encounters. For instance, the back part of your skull and the teeth and the bones associated with holding teeth and with holding the back part of the skull are tissues of very high growth priority. In short, individuals, almost irrespective of what environment they grow up in, tend to grow much the same size of teeth and much the same size of the back of the skull. The cranium, on the other hand, tends to be a tissue of low growth priority for a very simple and very convincing reason. The brain of an individual is a tissue of low growth priority. That is the outer cortex, not the lower parts of the brain. The brain stem tends to grow, tends to have rather high growth priority. It tends to be developed, but the outer cortex is quite malleable and doesn't do so well, and does reflect for this reason the type of population quality that I was referring to. It took me some time, because even scientists change their minds, that this was not a proper way of looking at it, that I was looking at a type of development that was associated with a rather natural phenomenon that is dispersal, and that our animal studies led us finally to the conclusion that we had here a programmed development of the genome, which was triggered under certain conditions, namely when resources were quite abundant. And when resources were quite abundant, we developed individuals that were very competent in physically, that were very actively behaviorally, and that were exceedingly healthy. Very low rates of parasitism, very low rates of congenital maldeformities, and by and large, low rates of accidents as far as we could encounter. We went ahead, and it was a very tortuous route, in trying to see to what extent this did apply to human beings. Well, it did apply to human beings. I will let you on to that. And different cultures, different ways, different socioeconomic systems tend to produce individuals that are somewhat different in structure, in phenotypic development. Some of these are very close to the healthy individual, others are very far away from it indeed. Now, I was interested in what were the conditions in human societies under which these superbly developed individuals would come about, and I have summarized them only very briefly indeed, because only a few are of great significance. The first one is they must have an abundance of high protein food, primarily of animal origin. And they must have that during ontogeny. That is, during the time when they are growing and developing into mature individuals. A second condition is they must be deeply embedded in stable, long-lasting social bonds, such as found in an extended family. If you don't have that condition, there will be a reduction in development. And the third one is the one that I would like to dwell on a little bit more. They have to be continuously forced to practice diverse physical and intellectual skills. These are the conditions, the major conditions. There are others, but they are irrelevant for the present talk. Now I raise again the question, why environmental education? Why natural environments? Why environments anyway that we want to acquaint individuals with and speak of these environments in terms of environments? What I have to say at first will sound mundanely. Because natural environments give the opportunity for stimulation due to constant change. Natural environments are frequently found in flux. There are plants budding, blooming, growing, blossoming, fruiting, decaying, dying. You have it. Something is constantly changing, and the constant change generates curiosity, the constant change generates question, the constant change generates attention by the individual. There are the changes of the seasons that we all know, the changes of the landscape, of the weather, and of the situations that are encountered. Changes that at times stimulate or force an individual to do certain things. That is a very important point. Furthermore, aspects of the natural environment give us moments of enormous emotional stimulation. We call them inspirational. To some it may be a flock of ducks in the evening sky. To some it may be an eagle soaring up above. To others it may be a brook that he is associated with and something stimulates him. It is that emotional charge that's very important too. And furthermore, it offers the opportunity for doing things, something with your hands, for getting in there, getting yourselves dirty, plucking plants to bits and pieces, building forts, playing cowboys and Indians, running around in the fields and being steadily there. It's very mundane. Physiologically, ladies and gentlemen, this is nothing mundane at all. Nothing whatsoever. Physiologically, it means every time there is a stimulation taking place so that you can record it with our sophisticated instruments as electrical waves off the scalp. Every time that occurs, you have, at that moment, a pulsation of blood through blood vessels that have opened themselves up, because the depolarization of nervous tissue in the brain causes the release of carbon dioxide, which in turn opens up the blood vessels, which in turn permits blood to flow in, which in turn permits those cells to very quickly reconstitute themselves, which means that these cells will go into an active stage. And every stimulation that comes that way and causes the individual to be alert and doing something leaves a physical trace. That isn't just simply something that stimulates the mind, whatever that may be. There is a physiological change going on, a change that is measurable as an increase in the size of brain cells, as a lengthening of the axons, as a branching of the dendrites of the cells, of the increase in the number of glial cells that support the axon and support the neuron. It is a change in the ratio of the RNA versus the DNA molecules. It is a change in the speed of transmission along the nerve fiber. It is a change that is measurable ultimately in experimental animals as cubic centimeters or cubic inches, if you want to, in brain mass. That's what it means. If you don't have it, if you are not being stimulated, if you do not have the chance for whatever reason to do it, there is something that you suffer. And that something is permanent. Development foregone, only with great difficulty, can be obtained back in later life. And beyond a certain stage, it just simply isn't there. It isn't developed. And what does it physically mean? Same thing. Every motion that the child undertakes leaves behind its trace. The running and the kicking and the jumping, it's swimming around in a pool, out in a creek, aids to build bones, muscles. It continues to maintain the muscle mass. It stimulates the body into growth, so that indeed you have, as a consequence of this stimulation, a rather different kind of an individual than one who has not had the opportunity or the wish or whatever it may be to do this same thing. By and large, if you want to look at human development in terms of physically measurable entities, you will notice that those classes within a civilization that have had access to the natural environment and have been able to do most with it have been the upper classes. They've had the wealth to have the resources available for growth and development. They have had the wealth to permit a great amount of experience to their children. They have had the wealth to put them into specific institutions in which a great amount of exercise, in which a great amount of activity in the natural environment was called for and found acceptable. And it is these classes that resemble most closely the type of development that I earlier on called high quality and that I earlier on indicated as being the most healthy. If you look at studies which have been done of physical differences in the classes of Great Britain, then the upper classes are inches taller in body size. They have considerably higher IQs on average. They have the dolichocephalic head, that is the long head, that is associated with great physical activities and great physical exertion. There is immeasurable differences in these classes. And these differences can be found back as far back as the Bronze Ages. Now, I'm going to very briefly sum up what I have been stating. It is not irrelevant that we know more about environments, and it is not irrelevant that we know a good deal about how we, as human beings, develop within environments. I've tried to indicate to you that the natural environment is not something that will teach kids about the birds and the bees and that's about it, or maybe give them an emotional charge so that they will look at the sunset and like it, or look at a bunch of ducks flying by and like it. That's trivial. What is not trivial in this is that there is an effect left on them. An effect that can be measured in terms of capabilities. And this, ladies and gentlemen, is what I am seeing at the present time in the work that I am carrying out. Thank you for your patient listening.
Dr. Geist has already received questions from the floor, so if there are any.
That was very significant about the physical and intellectual growth. You hinted also, you pointed out, that the third factor was social stability or the social interaction. Competence, yes, sorry. Would you like to say a few more words on the importance of social competence?
Ladies and gentlemen, for those which may not have heard the question entirely, I was asked to elaborate somewhat on social competence. That is one of the most difficult things, in fact, to elaborate on. We hit upon this as we were going through reconstructions of lifestyles of late Paleolithic people. Because you should know that the late Paleolithic people had by far the best physical development that has been ever encountered in human beings. There's just no comparison between them and us on average, although some of us in the extreme do approach them. The late Paleolithic people were quite tall. They tended to average over 6 feet. We tend to average under 5'8". The bones speak of a superbly trained athletic body, and what is very interesting and significant is the brain size is some 20% larger than ours. They were the largest brained people, in fact, that lived, and they existed for a very long time indeed, something in excess of 30,000 years. Now, when we went through that, it became quite evident that without a great ability to cooperate with others, to be able to influence others, to be able to lead, but also to be able to accept the decision of others, their life could not proceed. That was the beginning. That's when we saw for the very first time that the development of social competence was one of the essential elements. We do know, of course, that where individuals have not grown up in tightly organized, cooperating units, such as the extended family, or such as nuclear families surrounded by 5-6 peer families, and so on and so forth, that there is a measurable difference in their abilities to remain healthy. And much of this leads back to what we may call frustrations that these individuals have experienced. They tend to experience a somewhat greater frequency of stress on average than those which have had the opportunity to grow up in the more tightly knit social group. We also find associated not only a greater breakdown of their physiology, but they also tend to they are found more frequently in need of supportive social institutions. It is this kind of data which leads us to suspect that social competence, the ability to not only get along, that's not enough, but the ability to understand other people, the ability to place themselves into their position, the ability to be reasonable, is an ability that is very, very important to health. It's almost a truism, actually, when you come down to it. That is what I meant when I spoke about social competence. Yes, please. I agree. Yes. I don't think that one can really get to that conclusion that easily, and I'll tell you why. If you study, for instance, there is a study, a number of studies actually, I've seen them, from South Africa, which indicate that the moment villagers go to our conception would be rather detestable urban areas, really the Negro does not live, as you know, in South Africa under the best conditions. They nevertheless respond surprisingly well in terms of growth and development and in health. And one of the reasons that always comes out is the following: that these individuals felt themselves liberated from the witchcraft of their village. The absence of those that had placed curses on them, or the absence of anyone who could place curses on them in the old village sense, was considered to be a great relief. It meant that there was a greater opportunity for individuals to do and to act without fear. Now, from what I do know about stress, that makes a lot of sense. Whether human beings go into this state of behavioral sync, one of course can question. The studies that indicate that when we are under great stress and suffer anomie and so on may come close to that, but I think there is a simpler hypothesis to all this, and that is that our socioeconomic system at present very greatly encourages the isolation of individuals as competitive units within society. That being the case, social bonds are fractured frequently, and that in turn being the case, it ought to lead to an increase in illness. Yes, please. The answer to that is urban planning. If you can get urban planners educated in the right direction. At present, urban planners are very much concerned with providing open spaces. Now, let's remember, I'm speaking about the urban planner. I'm not speaking about the urban developer. Those are two different animals, entirely. Yeah? The urban planner of today, and I think the future, is going to be pressing more and more for what goes under the slogan, design with nature. An attempt to leave creeks where they are, an attempt to leave groves of trees where they are, an attempt to increase the amount of green space, an attempt to maintain natural areas, ponds, whatever it is, within the city. So there is, in other words, some hope in the future. The one difficulty I see with that is that the urban planner of today does not quite realize that it is not enough to simply have natural environments. What you do need, in fact, are environments in which the individual during ontogeny can be a destructive little pest at times, and nature is able to heal it again. Now, you can't do that in the city. You can't go through a little urban park and everybody playing Indian and cowboys in it. You won't have a little urban park left anymore. You'll have an urban slum. You'll have something that is quite unattractive, something that no politician will want to maintain, something that the citizenry may go up in arms against. Here is one of the difficulties. I don't think that television is the answer, although I do think that a television is to some extent an answer. You can bring something there. I think that our schools have an obligation to do something here as well. I think that our national parks have a very great obligation to do something, and that something being, first of all, to be a source of accurate information about our Canadian ecosystems, the baselines that we have, that we, in fact, as Canadians, produce books and teaching material that reflects what we have in Canada. And it's a lot of fun to be able to speak about Canadian animals with students. I can vouch for that, because they are able to see later after the lectures, or after they've had a chat with you, some of the things you've been telling them about. And we are far too influenced by material coming from the United States. As an ecologist, I can vouch that a few 100 miles difference in latitude make a very great difference at times in ecology. So we are not nearly enough, I would say, northern oriented. We are feeding far too much from the south at the present time. It means also that somehow the knowledge that we have accumulated can be translated into material that does reach the schools. And as someone who has attempted to publish books, I can guarantee you it's a very difficult thing indeed to get in Canada something published that can also be distributed. Here are some of my thoughts. They're off the top of the head. We can go into it deeper later on. Yes, please. No. No, I don't have a disagreement. In fact, it's absolutely fascinating to see what, I don't want to call it stress, what a certain amount of stimulation, in fact, does. And ladies and gentlemen, if you want to explore a mammalian system, a human being is a mammalian system. You cannot easily use it as an experimental animal, that's clear. For this reason, medical people and zoologists have to go to animal systems when they try to clarify a very basic issue. It's for this reason that we keep rats and dogs and cats and whatever else we have in our laboratories, so that we may explore some basic things and see whether these can be found again in human beings. In other words, whether we can make predictions that can be somehow verified on man. And some of the experiments on rats are absolutely fascinating. If you take individuals and malnourish them in one cage and just leave them to himself, you have generally small-bodied, rather jittery sort of individuals that the physiologists note have a higher rate of defecations and urination the moment they are placed into a strange environment. If, on the other hand, you feed a group of animals exactly the same amount per animal, but you go and you pinch their tails and handle them on almost daily matter, they tend to grow up into virtually normal individuals that have normal responses, normal body sizes. And if you do the same thing with rats on an adequate diet, you generate a quotation mark super rat by imposing that little bit of stress on it. It's a much more active, flourishing individual. It does a lot more than one that has not been stimulated. Yes, please? Mm-hmm. You've asked me a number of things. The first one, is it valid that great population densities and health in human society does not go hand in hand? I would say that if you would go out and apply a statistical correlation, I don't think you would find one too much, because you do have societies such as ourselves which have a rather high population density where we live together and yet have a rather good standard of health and a good standard of development. At the same time, I am perfectly cognizant that we are still very, very much subject to mutations of various disease agents, and that could get us, and this is even more the case in such countries as India, for instance. Now, the second part of your question is not entirely valid. Scientists do get together with urban planners. I'm one of them, for instance. And there are quite a number, well, in the last decade, a good number of schools have arisen which attempt, in fact, to bring scientists and urban planners and economists and architects and engineers together in order that they may develop curriculum that will produce individuals that are able to understand that way. Why can't you talk to the man? Of course I can talk to the man. He can talk to me as well. But every word that he says has a different conception behind it than mine. And it may be weeks before you discover that you've been talking past each other, rather than having in fact understood what the other individual says. This whole notion of interdisciplinarity is based on the assumption that if people willing and able will be able to get together and exchange, understand each other. But in practice, it has shown itself to be not the case. It's a very, very difficult thing to do indeed. My only hope at the present time is that the generation that follows ours will have a good number of individuals that have been trained by scientists and planners, and that both understand both worlds. The students that we have produced in the Faculty of Environmental Design are an astonishingly different group, not at all comparable to the normal scientists that I know of, and they can do things I can't do, for instance, and that makes it rather interesting at times. But it is difficult for older faculty members, in fact, to make this bridge. And we are not the only ones that have, to our sorrows, discovered this. Yes, please. Well, how does it affect social competence? Oh, I can make some guesses, but otherwise I'd say I don't know, because I have not looked into it. But what religion does do, of course, if you look at it in different societies, it very much supports the socioeconomic strategy that a society has. Now, the only difficulty with this is that there is a lag involved, and that there are also religious traditions which have come from past eras and which are not quite applicable, and then you have various conflicts and so on involved. But just how does it affect social competence? I just can't see that there is any relationship there. Yeah. Oh, from that point of view. Yes. Well, I can give you one example that you may want to play around with. But if you go to the classical Hindu religions, you find, in fact, that the Hindu scholar had a tremendous intellectual system built around the happenings that he saw about him. He was, in other words, exceedingly competent in devising explanations for, let me call it bluntly, some of the misery that was about him. But at the same time, I don't think that did very much for social competence at all, because he at the same time stated that this was a necessity, the misery that is. It had to exist. If it did not exist, then the universe or the samsara for that matter, the wheel of existence, would be imperfect. It is something, therefore, that you didn't tamper with. It is something that you left. You did not go ahead and change the environment around you. You accepted it. You learned to live with it. And you learned to follow the rules that were laid down by your religion in order to increase your social karma and be reborn again a better creature, if possible. Yes, please. Well, yes, there is a way, but I don't think that you can go whole hog with the present generation in any way, shape, or form. We draw our politicians by and large from the professional class. Those are the people that go out and become elected. They are lawyers frequently, very, very frequently lawyers. And it is today my claim, and I can't go into any detail, that in fact preventive medicine is not the business of medicine at all. Preventive medicine is a business of all professions. If anybody can be singled out particularly, it's the economist. He can muck up more human lives than all the medical teams in the world can put back together again. Far more. He's devastating in his decision making. But economists have a great hearing today, and they are concerned primarily with how to make the economic machinery tickle-toggle in a particular kind of way, and they have no concerns whatsoever about the secondary consequence of health, mainly because they are laboring under the conception that the human being is not so much a biological, or it is biological, but that's not interesting, that's irrelevant. He is primarily a ethical creature, he is a moral creature. You see? If you treat human beings in that shape, you forget the biological. You are only looking at a very small part of the system that needs to be understood when you speak about human environments. And in fact, for this reason, they have beautiful apologies for not looking at human biology, human health, and for this reason, they feel absolutely no responsibility towards health at all. That is something that deserves change. The future may be better in this regard. Yes, please. Well, may I only illustrate a little bit of some of the insights and some of the observations that I made when I was in India just a few weeks ago. I think you will find an answer in some of these. In India, we are dealing with a country severely overpopulated, in which every square inch of land is used, in which every twig that falls from a tree is being eagerly picked up by children, brought home so that it may be burnt and liberate some energy to cook some water. Where every dung pile from a cow, the moment it is dry and can be lifted off the dusty soil, is collected so that it may be burned for fuel. When you look at the people there, and you have trained yourselves by then to identify those features which speak of an environment that is of rather less than adequate, they're all there. They're all there, and to give you an idea of the wages that some of these people earn, a man can be hired for about 3 rupees a day, and 1 liter, that is 1 quart of milk, costs 2 rupees. In short, when we are making forecasts about economic disaster, isn't what I have just indicated already an economic disaster and a human tragedy? We don't have to believe in cataclysms. They don't have to take place. The tragedy is that here are already individuals, in enormous numbers of them, that haven't grown to human potentials at all. Just take a look at the children. Not enough food to permit most of them to survive, and definitely not enough food to permit just a very, very tiny fraction in the higher classes of India to develop into a competent, highly capable human being. They're destined for life to be considerably less than that. Something has been robbed from them. That's a tragedy. And our socio-economic system continues to push in that direction. Well, the Indians have recognized that. They've recognized it, and they have, first of all, made the policy that they're going to live within their own means. That's an incredible policy. There's no nation in this world except India that I know that has made this policy. If Germany, Great Britain, were to make that policy today, they'd be dead. They couldn't live within their own means. India's decided to live within the resources generated on its own soils. That's number one. Number two, they've said that 2% of the landscape is going to be or going to revert back to the natural conditions that India used to be in. Despite this poverty, they have a policy that we don't have in Canada. They have a policy that their major carnivore shall not become extinct. They have organized themselves at the federal and at the state level, even municipal level, to provide sanctuaries for tigers in which all grazing, all wood cutting, all wood collecting, all resource use is stopped. They have removed villages out of those areas and settled them outside. They've recognized within a decade the last 2% of the landscape will be devastated, and then they will be much the poorer for it. They might as well crunch down now. They have, of course, gone in and gone into birth control and sterilization programs very hard. They've literally coerced and forced people into doing it. Well, you don't have to coerce people into that very much. If you can offer somebody 100 rupee for sterilization, why, he'll give you his arm as well. Because 100 rupees is an enormous amount of money for an Indian. 100 rupees is wealth. And if he gets a transistor radio on top of that, then he has something he couldn't earn in his whole lifetime. It becomes not only a status symbol, it becomes sort of a, well, it does become a symbol that he's alive and well in the 20th century, because nobody else around his village is going to have it. They can't afford it, ever. And it is a pity that very likely this policy is going to fall flat on its face, for the very simple reason that the traditional child-rearing practices of India will ensure that a high mortality amongst the 2 children that are now permitted per family is going to continue. And that will make it probably politically unviable. So you have to have a countermeasure to the policy of birth control and population control, and that is of maximizing individual development. And that's something that has not been recognized, which is a pity. Yes, please. Wonderful question. A wonderful question to which I have simply no answer at the present time. Well, you should be acquainted with some of the wild stuff that comes my way. And I told you that in principle, complex systems have the nasty habit of doing things that you don't expect them, want them, or hope them to do. That doesn't mean that I'm a defeatist along this line. But I would state the following, that rather than if we are going to have a population policy, and I think we are going to eventually, then the population policy must begin, in my opinion, with a statement that we must maximize individual development. And that from that, so many things follow that a good number of things that we do today become quite unacceptable. See, if you look in the long run, we have almost no option but to reduce the population to a very, very fraction of what exists today on this globe. Because only then can we hope to maintain in perpetuity, or at least whatever that perpetuity may mean, for a long time period, the productivity of the landscapes that we depend on. We are today far beyond what can be considered to be a population that will permit superb development of individuals. We're far beyond that. There's so many problems in that area. Yes, please. Mhm. Yes. You'd have to restart further back than that. It begins in the family. It begins with the type of work that we have. It has its fingers in the economic system that we carry. In order to maximize the development of the individual, we may have noticed one point that we require very stable, lasting social ties, yeah? And that by far the best social milieu tends to be that of a very stable social extended family with several generations living together. Well, our economic system does not permit that. It does not permit that for the very simple reason that in order to maximize income, you cannot maintain that system. Ultimately, in order to maximize income, you're going to find that marriage, for instance, will disappear. And with that, I am really frightened, because our studies are so crystal clear that children raised in institutions, children raised away from the rich social milieu, are disadvantaged in many regards. Or maybe they will never know the difference. But I certainly suspect, have every reason, in fact, to believe that I am considerably less than what I could have been. That my genetic program is, in fact, much better than the reality at present. Yes, economics has to be revamped, family has to be revamped, our way of thinking about food has to be revamped, many things have to be revamped. If you go and ask yourselves how to develop these individuals, then you start running into just these sort of things. Yes, please. Yeah. Well, yes, it's diminishing in so far as we have taken good agricultural land and flooded it. That's true. It is diminishing slowly, in that we have exposed good agricultural winds to dust, to wind and sun, which last year has carried up away up to 5 inches of topsoil in some parts of Alberta, and which will very likely carry away even more in this coming year. In fact, we expect black blizzards this summer. It's true that it's diminishing, but then there's also the great weather factors. Over the last 8-9 years, we've had an increase of 10% in the area covered by snow in the northern hemisphere. That's a very, very large increase. So there's various factors which would tend at the present time to reduce our ability to produce food per se, and of course also protein food. But one of the things that this brings out, and I just heard it on the radio today again, is this whole bloody nonsense of equating an adequate diet in terms of calories. That's just absolute nonsense. An adequate diet is based not only on calories, it is very, very much based on protein, and is based very much on the kind of protein that you bring in. And it is based on the minerals and on the vitamins that have to be brought in there as well. And to speak about glibly, about producing more wheat and measuring it in terms of calories is ridiculous, because you can feed individuals on wheat all that you want, but you're never going to get a well-nourished individual out of it. You need much more than that. And it's the protein that's the master nutrient. Animal protein. If you want to do the same thing with plants, you can do it. But it requires a great amount of knowledge, because it is very difficult to get from plants the necessary rare amino acids. You've got to balance it out. You've got to go to some of the old ethnic diets, which are quite interesting. If you look at some of the Chinese diets, for instance, there is an indication that a great mixing of plants, or the Indian diet, particularly the Indian diet, A great mixing of diverse plants gives them an adequate diet. It doesn't give them a diet that maximizes development, though. The easier way is to go and do it via animals. Well, I can also repeat the questions if that makes it easier. Yes, please.
What do you think can be done at this point to produce more of this type of environmental education there in the public schools?
Good heavens, I wish it would take place at home. This is not a blow to teachers, not at all. I'm by now quite convinced that a very, very, very good many of them are a wonderful, dedicated, very humane, very idealistic persons. Not at all against the teachers. But I wish it would take place at home. I wish that is the place where it ought to be. Because if there is a tie between the growing child and the parent via the environment, then I do know that that child will get the attention that it so gravely deserves and needs. That would be it. I just wish we had more people going out and being active and interested. But the school has done something, and I think the school can do so much, and for many, many children, the school will be the only place. I'm aware of that too. I don't know. I'm not teaching in that system. I don't know what to do. That's up to you. Yes, please.
Kind of governments are going to be in
place. If you have totally authoritarian governments in countries that are the net receivers of food, nothing much is going to happen. You're going to have one wave of starvation after the next, and you're going to have a slow reduction in population size. You may have, in some countries, severe riots, but as long as the army is well fed, and they usually are well fed, I don't foresee too much, except more dying, more underdevelopment, more horrendous misery. Well, it looks as if we've kept the audience long enough. Thank you.